Zach, tell us what you want to talk to with regard to Warhammer.
All I want to talk about just with both the current Warhammer games out, the whole toolbox approach to their core rule books and core kind of design mechanics.
Okay, so what are the games that are out?
So currently we've got Wrath and Glory from Ulisses Spiel, which is the Warhammer 40,000 role-playing game. And then we have Cubicle 7's fourth edition of the classic Warhammer Fantasy Roleply, which both of them approach the setting with this kind of just big open gajillion options in the core rule book, which I think, well, the first thing I want to say is Wrath and Glory is fun. Playing the quick start, the Blessings Unheralded, I think you can get from drive-through still. A lot of fun. Players had a lot of fun. Easy to learn system. You're rolling dice, shooting demons, having fun. But after getting the core rule book, I was kind of let down. They take this approach of trying to be like, with just this one book, you can do anything in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, which is very, very vast. Starting with my criticism is the classes. So the whole game kind of just assumes like it's like how Warhammer Fantasy does it. You start as a guardsman, for example, and you'll go through that, and then you'll level up of sorts and advance to a new higher level class. But even amongst like just the Imperial options, it's missing a lot of steps in a lot of these upgrades, and none of them are very specific. It's very bland. You got the very basic ones. And then even when you get to like Space Marines, you know anything about the cannon, they start off as, a scout and then become, do other things in between. But you're missing the middle step between scout and becoming a full-blown tactical Marine.
What is that middle step?
So like in the lore, you start off if you survive the big grueling training process, you become a scout, and then you become a devastator who's like a heavy weapons guy, so you can learn how, the basics of battle, shoot things from afar. And then you become an assault Marine. You get a big chainsaw and a jetpack. And then you become just the regular, Space Marine with the bolter, which, I mean, if you're going to make a game about advancing, in levels of power, I feel like it's kind of important, at least in that case, to have those middle steps. Mm-hmm. And even like, because the big thing is it's set during the current, the lore with all the Primaris, the extra large Space Marines. But even with the core rule book, you don't get any advancement from them. You just get the basic intercessor, I think it's called. So which the Space Marines, both the regular ones and the Primaris, they count as separate races in terms of what classes you can go into. So if you want to play as the shiny, extra large new Space Marines, you're kind of stuck with one career, and that's all you can do. I mean, I'm assuming they're going to rectify that with a whole stack of source books, which then you get into all of the aliens and chaos, and it's interesting they chose to put those, because you don't get a whole list of playable options like you do with the Imperium. You get at most 3, so it seems a little lackluster. And to be honest, I would have rather them saved all of the non-loyalist Imperial classes for splat books, where they could have given it the attention it needs to really be fun, not just a few random items or classes, which almost, it seems just like page filler times when you're reading it.
So you talked about how this game kind of tries to do everything. So this is in contrast to previous Warhammer games, like you ran one for us, like Dark Heresy or Rogue Trader, which all have really different. Can you talk about like the different feels and the different types of games that those do?
Yeah. the previous the D100 based ones from Black Industries, I think was the original publisher of Rogue Trader, and then Fantasy Flight. They were all the same game system, this D100 based one, but each rule set had a theme to its classes and what its campaigns would be like. There's the Dark Heresy, which I ran for you guys, was your agents of the Inquisition, press ganged into service by an Inquisitor. But then it expands by that. There was Death Watch, which lets you play Space Marines who are joined the Inquisition to fight aliens. And then my favorite, which was Rogue Trader, which has an anti-Star Trek feel. You are applying the galaxy to make money and, just if you want to crush, rebellions or start your own colonies, basically become a king of sorts. I feel like those games were better. I enjoyed the actual rules of Wrath and Glory more, but I feel like the themed rule sets were a little bit tighter in terms of like what kind of characters you make, because there's a large amount of options amongst the previous 40K titles for very specific character types you can do. And I think that the game benefited from that tight feel.
Well, I mean, it's one of these enormous universes, right? And I think it can be really hard to get into. I think that the smart thing was with those previous games is that they did focus on just a narrow window that they could then flesh out very well and provide a very rich experience. I definitely could see that the toolbox approach might not be the best way to go with that.
Yeah. In that case, the toolbox was not probably the best choice.
And the game is not up on the website anymore.
Yeah, I was reading about that. It's not on Ulisses Spiel's website. It's still for sale on Drive-Thru RPG. Ulisses Spiel,
Sorry,
but on their
furniture
actual
moving upstairs. Sorry. So it's still for sale on Drive-Thru, you're saying?
Yeah, but it seems odd that it's been taken down, just the entire tab for the page about the game from their actual website. Seems a little
Wow, that's interesting. What has the critical response been like? Do other people feel the same way you do?
I've seen some people criticizing the toolbox. People overall seem to enjoy it. I think the big issue is that it's not getting the reception that they had hoped for, because when in the months prior to it, the Games Workshop made a really big deal about hyping the game up. They even had like a series of like comics commissioned to put on their Warhammer community site that taught the game to like a group of players playing it around one of their living rooms or something.
Well, you've been playing Games Workshop games a lot longer than I have, and I know that even in the short time I've been buying them and playing them, you buy a game and then that line might get discontinued next month. So they're always trying new things, and when the new things don't work out, I think they pull things. Now, this of course would be a license or some kind of cooperation with the other company, but with Ulisses Spiel. But did you finish what you were saying about the promotion?
I think the big hope for when they started the license was that the role-playing game would draw in a bunch of people who exclusively played 40K and don't play role-playing games at all, just simply by the theme.
Right.
And to a lesser extent, it would draw in people who liked role-playing games eventually into actual miniatures 40K. But from what I've heard, it's not really doing that. And
like, does it have miniatures in it? Is that part of the game, or not really?
There is a brief side box in the chapter on combat about using miniatures and mats, but you can play it without it. I know they make a set of like generic, like the Paizo flip mats. They just released one that like one side's like a wasteland desert and the other is like a factory or something. So they want you to use miniatures, but I mean, unless you have a group where everybody plays a smattering of races from 40K, you're going to be shelling a lot of money to get enough miniatures to represent everything in that game.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you want to move on to the fantasy game, which is also a sandbox, or we got more to say about Wrath and Glory?
That's really all I have to say about Wrath and Glory. Besides, I mean, it's a good game. If I had to say whether it's a good, bad, or all right game, I'd say it's a good game. I have not played with the full rule set. I've only played the quick start, but that was a lot of fun. So if anyone's wanting to try it, I think it's like $5 on drive-through.
That's cool. Yeah, maybe we'll do that. All right, and then tell us about the second game, which is also a toolbox.
Yes, Warhammer Fantasy 4th edition is also a big toolbox setting. Well, not setting, but rule set. But I think it implements that substantially better. So basically, I mean, Warhammer Fantasy is also a very large, it's an entire world with entire, historical periods you could play it in, but keeping with the old school vibe, because Warhammer Fantasy has always been a very distinct game. It wasn't that's how there was the lore for Warhammer Fantasy was developed for the role-playing game. So it's always been a very in-depth world. But just this current edition, Cubicle 7 made the smart choice to not just focus it on a particular region, but a region within a region. So the Empire, the classic, Holy Roman Empire themed fantasy kingdom, it focuses this current edition not just on the whole empire, but specifically on Reichland, the capital of the empire. And 10 years before if anybody remembers from way back when, the Storm of Chaos, which was a big thing, Games Workshop, 10 years before that, where basically all the races duke it out in the center of the empire. But presenting this theme of Reichland, it gives you only they use species, they're not race anymore, but species is present there. And also, I thought it was interesting, a nice touch. There's 4 of them, but it's not, you can roll. It's very big into like the random rolling charts. It's not just, 20% on a D100 for each of those. It's actually, the percents are set to the actual demographics of the empire. So it's like 1 through 80, you're a human. And then the rest of the other, like 20% is divided up amongst halflings, dwarves, high elves, and wood elves. And then the professions you can enter in the careers, they are all specifically Reichland based things you'd find there. So you're not going to get a bunch of like far flung types of characters, but there's even a whole class of just river people, because rivers and like canals crisscross Reichland. So there's a whole class for that and a whole bunch of sub professions. You can go in from basically even like you can be like a dock worker or like a river pirate or things like that, or very specific things.
Yeah, like in Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition, they had very specific. They've always had very specific occupations and things like that. How does it compare to? So even though they made it a sandbox, they made it like a much smaller sandbox than Wrath and Glory was trying to do. It sounds like.
Yeah. From what I've gleaned from hosts from Don McDowell, he's very enthusiastic about the project, and he's mentioned some very interesting choices for this game. This is going to be the first time that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay has touched on the new world, so where the lizard men live, and Ulthuan, where the high elves live and the dark elves live. So I'm very excited for that. But they're taking it bit by bit. They're not trying to, the same approach they had with when they published One Ring. It was originally supposed to be like a single, like a set of slipcases of different periods and regions, but they scrapped that idea because, if you wanted all of them, you'd be forced to buy a bunch of repeated material in terms of the core rule book, like the Fantasy Flight Star Wars games. So now there's just the core book with the starting year and the starting region, and all of the other source books kind of just form this expanding bubble of options and places you can go around it, which I think is a nice approach. And that's what they're doing with Warhammer also.
And the system is going to be, I suppose, pretty different from Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition, which had the story dice.
Ooh.
Kind of a more complicated version of Star Wars Fantasy Flight.
So, I have to say, I am a person who never gets rid of role-playing games, ever.
Me too. It's in the other room.
And Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition was something I actually sold in an auction because it's not fun.
Yeah. I mean,
people, if you're very much into like board gamey stuff, it might be a good transition, but it's the everything. They decided to just no books and books, and the books are like 60 pages long. Everything on cards and trackers and tokens and markers, and for like and the one that limits the amount of players you can actually have.
Right. You had to buy additional boxes to get more players.
It was like $40 for like a box set that let you add one more player. But then it's like, even with just the core set, it's to have like a GM and 3 players. You'd need a whole like 6x4 table. And the entire thing would be smattered with cards and peripheral accessories, which, I mean, I like the narrative dice, but I didn't like everything else.
Yeah, I see what they were trying to do, because at the time I was talking to Chris Birch at Modifius. We were talking about developing a game that used all the cool stuff from board games and put them in role-playing games, kind of spruce up the role-playing game and to give it like, you know, a little bit of polish and zip and stuff like that. And just because board games, you know, at that time were starting to become really freaking cool and the art was awesome, and it would be nice to have some of these things. We said you could have a character that was a bunch of cards and things. But I think the thing, and you know, the same thing was happening with D&D 4e. But I think that the thing is like 4 cards is okay, but not like 3 decks of cards. Like Zach is right, the sheer stuff, and then the tokens. You had to have a tracker for the party, and then you had to have a tracker for your stance every round.
Build
and you had to
a little thing, yeah.
You had to build a little thing, a chain of tokens. And you had to move your stance every round, and which is the same thing that you have in the One Ring. You have stances, but it's very simple, and you don't need a token and tracker and all this stuff to do it. It was just overkill. I mean, I've got 10 pounds of that game in the other room, and like I've never played it. I love that the books are short. I love that the stuff's on cards in a way, but it's just, you know, Fantasy Flight, man. They can't just have 20 cards. They got to have 500.
Yeah. Another big criticism of the Fantasy Flight one is, I mean, at least from the get-go, it seemed like they were never going to expand beyond the Empire, which is very limited because it's a whole wide world of, you know, to explore and have, you know, interesting adventures in. But they just were adamant, like, this is a game set in the Empire, and we're never going to do anything outside of it.
Yeah, that's why I really liked the like late Wizards of the Coast Star Wars game, Saga Edition. It was shortly before they made 4th edition, and it was like before the Disney Star Wars, of course, and it was right when like the expanded universe was at its peak, and so they brought in all these like all the stuff from like the comics and like the video games. There was a Knights of the Old Republic source book, and it's like all those really good stories that are kind of the best of each of those mediums that they could bring in and have, and it made the world feel big because there's stuff, because, you know, I've seen all the Star Wars movies like many times, and there was stuff in there that was lore that I hadn't heard of because it was from the comics or something, and it felt really cool. It felt like the world was big, and I wanted to learn more about it. But when you have like a narrow setting like that, it can feel too familiar.
So that's kind of an argument against the very narrow setting in the sandbox.
Yeah, I was going to bring this up because this is an interesting issue about like, do you make a game with this huge big world where you can do anything, or do you make like a very specific game where you just play these types of characters doing this thing? I feel like a lot of older games are the former, where they're just this huge setting material where you can do anything. And then a lot of the newer indie games with like rules light stuff have really focused in on like, no, we just want to do this type of game. Like stuff like Blades in the Dark, where it's like, we just want to play a game where you're doing heists in this specific setting, playing these types of characters.
I think it's a European style, because French games are always like, I feel like pretty well focused on an area, and they have like a strong narrative. A lot of the Swedish games, like Symbaroum, is like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like Symbaroum has a strong core activity?
Oh, I don't know.
Yes.
Does it? Yeah, fighting. I don't know.
I mean, I've never played it, but I've read it, and I own a bunch of stuff for it. But I mean, I guess it's adventuring.
Oh
That's
yeah, it's treasure hunting. That's what it is. You're looking for relics.
I'm assuming you're trying to like build or get powerful enough, or not even power, just smart enough to not die long enough to get to Simbar, the capital of the old Simbaroom, which is at the center of the forest.
But Scott, sorry, go ahead, Zach.
I mean, like that's the end game.
Yeah, you're plumbing Davakar for exactly what Zach said.
Okay,
so how does this lead back to what you're saying, Scott?
I mean, just comparing the type of Warhammer, the first type of Warhammer game that Zach talked about, where it tries to sort of be everything, and then like the older ones we talked about, stuff like Rogue Trader, where it's just like, no, it's just this specific slice of the world, and we're gonna like direct all our attention here and just tell games of this tone, of this style. I'm interested in like these two things as styles and whether one is better or worse. Like, are there types of players that really like one style versus the other? I just wonder like what you guys' experience with that are. Do you think that like one style is moving out of fashion?
I would say they're kind of connected. Well, at least my preference for like the actual logistics of presenting a setting, I think it's more of a gradient. I kind of prefer it when games give like a tight focus with the core rule book, but as time progresses, they can splat books will build out into so you can get a tight feel if you really want that, or you can have a big globe-trotting game with a whole cast of international characters eventually. But I mean, if you spread it out, it just doesn't feel so cramped like Wrath and Glory.
I kind of think it depends on the player, and I know that's not really like an exciting argument, but I mean, at my age, man, I barely read core books. I just read the stuff I have to read to get the game going. So that works for me because it gives me I can read about the setting. It makes it easier for me. But if you're like a 10-year-old kid and you have time to read the book cover to cover a few times and really get into the world, and you want to create your own campaign and you want to know how to do that and what's available, then you're going to want something that's more of a toolbox. I think.
Yeah, I just think of like the ultimate toolbox game. You guys ever played Traveler? Kind of like the old Mongoose ones?
I own it, or I owned it when I was a kid. I actually was 10 years old, and I read it cover to cover several times. Never found anybody who wanted to play it because it was
die in character creation in that.
Yeah, you could.
You can, yeah. So it's this sci-fi setting. How would you describe it? It's
hard sci-fi.
I'd say it's pretty hard. It's very detailed. It's set up so that you can do kind of any kind of sci-fi you want.
As long as it's hard sci-fi.
Yeah, that's true. It's definitely not space opera.
I mean, like a laser, they actually explain how it would work. They explain how all the technology could actually work. It takes ages to get places.
And it has like a lot of social stuff too. Like, what is it? Like steward is like an important skill that you can have. There's like this big like political hierarchy that you can navigate. And the thing about it is that there's not really a strong core activity. It's just kind of this big, fast world. And it's just like, you can kind of do whatever you want. I was listening to the Ken and Robin podcast, Ken and Robin talk about stuff. And he was talking about a Traveler game he played with a bunch of accountants who they just want us to like make investments and like make a bunch of money. And he was like, this is not fun. So I'm just going to have like a huge intergalactic war breakout. And I'm like, all right, great. We're going to get into war profiteering. So like, that's a game where you can do stuff like that. You can just kind of make your own fun with this huge, big system.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't see myself personally going for a game like that these days. I like having a specific setting there. That's why another reason I tend to buy published adventures, because I want to tell a tight story, and then I want to have that path of a story, and then I want to like use my imagination to kind of like decorate everything along the path and make all these people, and that's where I have fun. But I want to have that.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of messy if you have this game that's just, it can be about anything. Like, it even has like this huge complicated thing about tech levels. Like there's 12 tech levels of worlds. And so level 0 is like Mars or whatever. And level 1 is like, okay, there's like primitive life. And level 2 is like where Earth is now. And you go all the way up to 12 where people are like ascended AIs that have like integrated things. And you can play Traveler in like Knights ages or something. I was talking to the GM and I was like, oh, like what tech level are we going to be? And he's like, you can be any of them. I was like, yeah, but like, are we going to be like AIs? Are we going to be like earth scientists? Like, you could be any of them, but it's like, no, I just want a window. I just want something to do, like something to nail down. So it can be really overwhelming when you have a game that vast.
So let's bring this back around, Zach, to Warhammer.
Yeah, so the Warhammer Fantasy, the current one, definitely, it has a very tight feel from, you know, the starting gates. But I mean, even things I've heard, I read some of the Don McDowell mention that, you know, wouldn't it be cool if there was, you know, dark elf political intrigue campaigns? And I'm like, that sounds amazing. That sounds like the kind of game I want to play, because by political intrigue, I mean they're just stabbing everybody. And also that's something that none of the 3 previous editions have even touched on. So it's very exciting. But it's a lot of good content coming. A lot of not typical of, you know, the war game when it was still around. All of the adventures so far have been kind of these urban-based kind of interactions with other people. No big, you know, giant monster slaying. Which, I mean, the rulebook has a couple giant monsters, and they are nasty. Which brings me also to the toolbox pros for monsters. It's basically, I was really liked what they did is they gave you, so there's basically a basic stat line for every, you know, the classic Warhammer monsters. But then you have, you know, traits they have, and then suggested traits to customize them more. So you could kind of tailor these monsters, just, you know, very generic monsters. You can tailor them any way you want. So kind of eliminates the need for, you know, pages and pages and pages of, you know, statted out monsters to, you know, make a difference between the goblin shaman and the ogre man-eater. Or
That's cool.
more so that they're 2 different goblins, the chief and the shaman. You can just use the same stats, but this guy's got these keywords and abilities, and this guy's got those ones, and they're going to function very, very differently from the run-of-the-mill ones who just have the basic keywords. I think keywords is the word. Keywords or abilities. It's something along those lines.
So if you're not familiar with the lore, what would draw you to the game aside from the lore? Do you know what I mean?
Well, the thing about Warhammer Fantasy as a role-playing game as opposed to Warhammer 40K is it's always been separate from the war game. Like, there's an entire community of people who love Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and have played it for decades, but have never picked up the miniatures game. And also that's another reason that the tight initial setting, if you're not, you know, you've never read any of the Black Library novels or played the war game, it focuses on this one specific region of the world, and it also describes it in really great detail to give you a good overview of what that's like. And also the book itself starts out with a really good introduction to the setting, these big, you know, double page art spreads with kind of like these in-game descriptions of the Empire, and those end with like a letter from like a gray wizard writing to a guy down in the border kingdoms about, you know, your dad's dead, come and claim your inheritance, but the Empire can be a kind of scary place. And that got this letter written in, you know, in world, which I think is a neat touch.
Cool.
That does sound really cool.
Anything else you want to say about it?
Check it out. I think it's one of the better games I've picked up in the last few years.
Great.
2 thumbs up.